In this set of lectures, we're going to talk about the cerebellum. Cerebellum literally means little brain. It's situated here underneath of the occipital lobe. It's about 10% of the brain's mass, but contains about 50% of its neurons. So the cerebellar cortex has what's called a granule cell layer, which is really densely packed with neurons, and we'll talk about that in the last segment of this lecture. It also forms the roof of the fourth ventricle. Gross anatomy of the cerebellum, as you recall from the last slide, it sits underneath the occipital lobe. So if we remove the occipital lobe, then you're looking down on this image of the cerebellum. So just out of the plane of the slide, on top of it would be sitting the occipital lobe. And here is the brainstem. There are two cerebellar hemispheres. We have a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere. And within each hemisphere, we have a couple of lobes. We have an anterior lobe and a posterior lobe. These are separated by the primary fissure, which kind of runs along here. You'll note that the surface of the cerebellum has all of these little lines, and these are kind of the equivalent of sulci and gyri in the cortex, where you have big gyri and big sulci, so you have kind of a gross appearance of the brain. In the cerebellum, these are much finer and smaller, and we call them folia. And folia, I believe, means page, and so if you think about a portfolio is pages, and so the folia of the cerebellum are almost like the pages of a book. They're very small and very thin when you compare them to the sulci and gyri of the cerebral cortex. On the midline is this structure that early anatomists thought looked like a worm, and so they called it the vermis. Vermis means worm-like. From the ventral side, if we cut off the brainstem and are looking up underneath the cerebellum, we can still see the vermis. We can see part of that anterior lobe and the posterior lobe. And if we remove the brainstem, what we can see are some midline structures. We see the flocculus, which is over here and over here. And we see the nodulus here. These three structures are combined into what we call the flocculonodular lobe. Now you wonder, why do I need to know these lobes? Well, the bottom line is that the different lobes of the cerebellum have different functions and are related to different sensory systems within the nervous system, and have different areas of motion that they're involved with. We're not going to go into those very deeply, but we'll talk a little bit about that in the last section. In the next section, we're going to talk about these guys, the peduncles, that actually physically attach the cerebellum to the brainstem.